Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another video for our distance learning during the pandemic of 2020. This video is going to be part of a two-part video where we look at the end of World War II, and then we look at the impacts and the consequences of World War II. So where we're going to begin today is with how the war comes to an end in Europe. And so what we're looking at right now is a map of the surrounding area of the city of Berlin. And in April and May of 1945, the Russian army, the Soviet army, the Red Army, surrounded and laid siege to the city of Berlin and started to shell that capital city with artillery. The city was just obliterated. Everything came apart. Hitler, of course, was hiding in the Führer bunker, in this reinforced concrete bunker underground. He unleashed the Volkssturm, the children and the old people, against the oncoming Soviet army. And everybody kind of knew that the war was coming to an end quickly, but the particulars for how this was going to happen really weren't clear yet. Now, in the meantime, a couple of very, very important things happened. On April 12th of 1945, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States died unexpectedly, leaving his vice president, Harry Truman, to be the president of the United States. So that was right at the end of the war. The guy who's been running the show really since the early 1930s is all of a sudden no longer available to be the president of the United States. That was a huge shift, and that's going to have some pretty big consequences. Next, what we see is Mussolini himself was actually captured and executed by Italian partisans, by Italian soldiers fighting for the Allies. He was captured and executed on April the 28th. So again, very, very rapidly, we're seeing the loss of some major leaders from World War II. We see the loss of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12th. On April 28th, we see the loss of Mussolini. And then, of course, we come to Hitler himself. On April 28th, in the Reichsfuhrer bunker, Adolf Hitler married his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, who you see pictured here next to him. 28th of April, 1945, they get married in a private ceremony in the Führer bunker. April 30th, both of them chose to end their lives rather than being captured by the Soviet army. Eva Braun took a cyanide pill to poison herself. Hitler shot himself to ultimately end their lives. Now, his driver later testified to the fact that he took both of their bodies outside of the bunker, covered them in diesel fuel, and incinerated their bodies so that their bodies wouldn't be captured by the Soviet army, because they didn't want their bodies to be desecrated and to be paraded around as kind of like war trophies. But Hitler himself ultimately died, and this is going to be part of a long-term trend inside of Germany, where lots and lots of Germans who had been bought into National Socialism and Nazism ultimately started to commit suicide. And we see about 2 million of those particular really, really sad and unfortunate events take place towards the end of the war, and as the Germans realize that they're going to face consequences for what happened. Now, without Hitler as the Führer, ultimately Germany needs to have some sort of government figure to surrender, and the guy who was available and the guy who Hitler trusted to continue as the Führer after himself was the admiral of the Kriegsmarine, whose name was Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz was made the new president of Germany, and ultimately he had one job, and the one job that he carried out was he immediately ordered the German military all over the world to stand down and surrender. On May the 7th, 1945, Admiral Dönitz signed the instrument of surrender, and ultimately May 7th is referred to as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and that's how the war really comes to an end in Europe. Now, beyond the European theater, we also have what's going on in the Pacific that we need to tidy up. So, of course, the last time when we talked about the Pacific, we talked about the process of island hopping, where you skip over the heavily fortified islands, you capture the weaker islands, and you starve the Japanese soldiers off of those fortress islands. That process continued along those two chains of islands until the last two really major islands in the chains. In the chain that gets close to the Asian mainland, we have an island called Okinawa. The battle for Okinawa lasted from April 1st until June 22nd, 1945, and that was a very difficult fight, but it gave us an airstrip to use to start bombing Japan. Iwo Jima's battle, which is on that outer chain of islands, started on February 19th and lasted until March the 26th of 1945. Again, tens of thousands of American casualties to capture those islands, but both of them were important because both of them allowed us to start bombing Japan, mainland Japan, 24 hours a day, and we absolutely started to do that. March 9th and 10th of 1945, the United States began the firebombing of the city of Tokyo. The firebombs are different than normal bombs because what firebombs do is they explode, but they also burn. And since a lot of these buildings were made out of wood, and some of them were even made out of wood and paper, the fire that was caught in Tokyo burned so hot that it actually caused the air to catch on fire, and it created a condition which is called a firestorm. The really bad part of a firestorm is it consumes all of the oxygen in the atmosphere. And so even when people were in bomb shelters, even when people were hiding underground, many of them were killed in this attack because ultimately they suffocated as a result of the lack of oxygen. Despite this massively destructive event, the Japanese government refused to surrender. And so the American military started to make preparations and plans for an invasion of mainland Japan. The problem is, the new president of the United States, President Truman, was given a couple of choices. The first choice was to start an actual ground invasion of Japan. The estimates for that invasion were that it was going to kill 1 million American soldiers to be able to conquer mainland Japan. That's an awful lot of people to engage in one operation. However, the military secretly had another option in their back pocket, which President Truman, when he was the vice president of the United States, was never made aware of. They actually concealed this information from Vice President Truman. Secretly, the military, under the orders of the president, had been developing an operation called the Manhattan Project, which was the most secret operation of the entire war. It started in 1939 under the direction of several different laboratories and scientists, and the goal was to try to figure out a way of producing an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project started because the United States was pretty certain that the Germans were working on an atomic bomb of their own, and so we didn't want to have them develop this technology without us developing the technology first. Now, what we didn't realize was the Germans had actually given up on this technology, and when we conquered Germany, we got a hold of their technical plans and we realized that they were no longer working on an atomic bomb because they didn't think that they could technically make it work. After President Truman became the President of the United States, the military finally informed him that, by the way, Mr. President, we might have another option beyond just a mainland invasion of Japan. However, a couple problems existed. Number one, nobody knew if it worked. Number two, nobody really knew how to explain it, and we only had 3 devices built. President Truman was given the options of what to do, and ultimately what he decided to do was he said, we're going to test one of our bombs in the United States in secret to see if it even works. If it does, then we'll look at and explore the possibility of using it against Japan. So this decision was ultimately left to President Truman. This is a photograph of the stainless steel tower that was built in a place called Alamogordo in New Mexico, and on top of this tower was placed the nuclear device, the very first nuclear explosion ever, which was called Trinity. The decision was that they were ultimately going to test the Trinity bomb first to see if it actually even worked. On July the 16th of 1945, the Trinity detonation, this photograph was taken from about 25 miles away, vaporized that tower and left a gigantic crater behind, and turned actually the top layer of sand in the desert to glass. Now President Truman knew that the bomb worked, and so he had to decide what to do about it. Now the situation in 1945, in the summer of 1945, actually this map is specifically from August 1st of 1945, looked like this. The Japanese Empire was still very, very large. They still controlled a humongous amount of territory, and to go one place at a time to continue to defeat the Japanese seemed like it was going to take forever. And so President Truman decided that we were going to warn the Japanese of the imminent destruction that was about to rain down on them and to try to get them to surrender. To that end, the United States military started to drop these actual leaflets over Japan, listing 11 different cities that would be wiped off of the face of the earth if the Japanese government didn't surrender. Still, the Japanese government didn't surrender. So, on August 6th, 1945, in the morning, the atomic device called Little Boy was dropped over the city of Hiroshima. It instantly vaporized almost 100,000 people and, of course, caught fire to the city, destroyed the entire city, poisoned a lot of people. It caused massive, massive, massive destruction. But the Japanese government refused to surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, the atomic device called Fat Man was dropped over Nagasaki in an attempt to get the Japanese government to surrender and also to destroy their torpedo factory, some steel factories, some other major factories that existed in the city of Nagasaki. Now, after August 9th, one of the things that the Japanese didn't know is we were out of bombs. We didn't want them to know that, right? We had just vaporized 100,000 people in Hiroshima and 80,000 people in Nagasaki. We didn't want them to know that we couldn't continue to drop atomic bombs forever. And so on August the 15th, just 6 days after Nagasaki, the Japanese government announced that they were willing to surrender, but they asked for one condition. Our policy after Pearl Harbor was we were only going to accept an unconditional surrender. They had to completely surrender to us with no conditions whatsoever. The Japanese, after Nagasaki, on August 15th, came to us and asked for only one condition, which was, we want you to allow the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, to stay in power. On September the 1st, 1945, the Japanese government officially signed the Instruments of Surrender. Well, they officially surrendered on September 1st. They signed the Instruments of Surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd. And again, they were granted the only condition that they asked for, which was the emperor was allowed to remain in power. This then becomes VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, and the official fighting part of World War II comes to an end with the conditional surrender of Japan. So in the next video, what we're going to look at is consequences and impacts of World War II, and then we're going to start setting up how does World War II ultimately lead us into the Cold War. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Do leave a like if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe so that you get notifications of when the new videos are coming out. Stay healthy, stay safe, everybody, and as always, let me know either in the comments here or in Google Classroom if you have any questions.